Valerie?
Is this good? Can you hear in the back?
Lift it up just a bit.
Okay. Okay? I'll just lift myself down a little bit. Thank you so much. And Bob, thank you for inviting me here. I had the great pleasure of meeting Bob on the telephone when he called me one day to say that he was accepting one of my stories, and he was so kind and soft-spoken, and we ended up talking about half an hour and have since become friends, and it's been a friendship that's really enriched my life as well as a professional association, so I'm very grateful always to the Antioch Review. I did not choose to write about New York for some aesthetic or any other kind of a reason. I wrote stories set in New York because I grew up in New York. I wrote really about the world I knew, and I, wrote up my stories. I wrote about people that were plausible. They weren't people, I wrote fiction, but I wrote about what would be possible in New York, and it's very funny because later on people said, "Oh, that's such an amazing world you made up and you invented," and it's like, well, no, it's New York. I think all writers at some point write about where they come from and who they are. So that's how New York came to me. I also focused my first book around New York and New Yorkers because I had to. I was lucky that publishing through places like the Antioch Review, I had agents call me and say, "Hey, do you have a collection? Can we put out a book for you?" And I said, "Sure, I have all these stories, and this one's in California, and this one's in New York," and I was straightened out very quickly and told, no, it has to be linked. We don't publish collections of short stories anymore. Can you come up with a theme or an idea? And I said, sure, I have several stories that are connected, and I could certainly put all my characters under one roof and have them live in the same building in New York City. I grew up in a building on the Upper East Side, and I invented a Park Avenue building on a corner where there's a church house, so to make sure I was legal and okay, it's a fictional building called 980 Park Avenue. And eventually, the publisher I found ended up publishing it as a novel. So, this is what happens in publishing world. We don't completely shape our own art. But when I was thinking about coming tonight, and it's very funny too, because later on I got reviews and people talked to me about, "Oh, this is a social history of New York." I'm like, "You're kidding." I just wrote some stories and put them in chronological order, and they span 30 years in this, in this one microcosm of New York. And but that's what I've been told. And recently, even someone came up to me and said, "Oh, you did that perfect. You showed the tragedy of the rise of the meritocracy." I'm like, no way. Yes, there's all this, there's the old guard has opened up and there's diversity, but now the meritocracy has greater problems, and it's like, I'm sorry, I've forgotten what they said, but it was just very, very funny. He had this whole social spin on it that I had not intended. I wrote about the world I knew and what had meaning to me, and I guess I tried to make meaning of what I grew up around. One of the things that I think an author can choose to do in writing about New York is picking one little ecosystem. That's how I chose a building, but other people choose a company, a neighborhood, one a group of a type of people. It is impossible to write about all of New York. New York is so varied and so, I hate the word diverse these days because I keep picturing like little stick fingers holding hands, like red, yellow, blue, and brown, and you know, and that's not what I mean. New York has a diversity that you can say, well, who's your character? He's Italian. Well, is that Italian from northern Italy who wears cashmere pajamas and camel color, or Italian that grew up in Brooklyn and whose grandmother still speaks the old language and doesn't speak English? There's a richness in New Yorkers that really make it pretty easy to write about. There's just, everywhere you look, there are interesting people and so many different groups and types that you just don't find anywhere else all together. The all-together piece of it is important too, because what New York offers is compression. And compression makes for tension, and tension makes for good stories. You know, you cannot go through a day in New York without having a lot of interaction. I live in the suburbs now, and I can go through a pretty simple day with fairly predictable interactions, but New York, there's a surprise every day. You know, you cannot anticipate your day here. And there's tension, you know, it's tight, it's small, it's uncomfortable, it's beautiful, it's weird. New York just constantly amazes, and it creates opportunities for resistance and really tension. You know, Pamela Painter was the one to quote this to me, that a story is two dogs and one bone. And that's the story of New York. Every time you try to move from one block to another, to take a seat on a subway, no matter what, there's tension and competition involved. So I think that's where it becomes very, very fertile for story writing, though sometimes aggravating for living, because of so much tension, so much pressure. Another aspect about writing about New York is the opportunity to hear New York voices. Everywhere you go, and again, because of this sharing of so little public space for so many people, you hear fantastic stories, you hear amazing voices. You can listen to someone at the table behind you in a restaurant and sort of figure out who they are. You know, you can figure out maybe what neighborhood they come from, what nationality, what are their concerns, are they very mainstream, are they alternative? It's a wonderful, the characters are everywhere, and in my writing I focus a lot upon the voices of my characters. That's something that matters to me a lot. So I've learned, living in New York and growing up here, that to listen, you know, to listen. How do people speak? What subtext is in in what they say? How do they talk? That's been fascinating to me as a writer. And the other thing is history in New York. I put together a collection of short stories that became a novel, but I wrote from stories that started in 1970 and ended in 2000, and you can't write about New York without writing about major history. We're affected by history all the time here, and in a way that I just don't feel in other parts of the United States. And there are moments, there's a sort of a common language of New York, moments that every New Yorker knows. There was, the garbage strike when the garbage was piled up. There's the doorman strike, and I wrote a story around that, where suddenly all these very wealthy residents were trying to drive an elevator and sort their own mail, and to disastrous results and plenty of conflict within the building. There's, obviously 9/11 was a huge factor. My book stopped at 2000, and I made a very conscious effort that I wanted it to stay there. I certainly could not go into that new world. And it was funny because as I was writing, I was, writing in those years of 98, 97, up through 2001, 2002, and my book was published in 2004. And I suddenly realized that everything had changed completely. And I had started out thinking I was writing a book about contemporary life, and suddenly I was writing about another period that had ended. So that was a profound experience as a writer, and interesting to step back and suddenly realize I was writing about a past that no longer existed. I don't know, I could go on and on about sort of the richness of writing about New York and the possibilities. But I do want to hear from others, and maybe we'll all talk too. Thank you.